it just expands what's possible in the amount of time and with the resources that we have.
The fact that you can kind of abstract that away without really totally understanding how these joins are working in the back end is really handy.
You got a bunch of reporters, you got a bunch of biologists. They're smart, engaged people, but like they're not engineers. How do you bridge that gap?
It decreases my personal workload, right? Like that I can supercharge these reporters by teaching them something that doesn't require them to understand all of SQL or all of how database indexing works or all of these things.
Yeah, just curious to hear a bit more about the Marshall Project. You've had a relationship with Hasura before I have with Hasura, so my boss knows you a lot better than I do. So I'm just kind of curious, your background, what does your company do? Just kind of that rundown.
So the very standard sort of introduction is that the Marshall Project is a nonprofit newsroom that is dedicated to creating a sense of urgency about the U.S. criminal justice system. We cover the entire U.S. criminal justice system from sort of a national perspective, which is a pretty unique it's a pretty unique sort of mission, I think. And a really important one because the U.S. criminal justice system, according to some estimates, affects half of all people in this country in some way or another. So it's a huge system. It has a lot of bearing on people's lives and has traditionally been maybe not as thoroughly covered as you might hope. Also, I'm David Eads. I'm the data editor at the Marshall Project. And then I guess the other thing I would say is I've been using Hasura going back 3 jobs, going back to ProPublica. I was looking for a solution to sort of bridge the gap between a Postgres database and a system that needed GraphQL or wanted to query using GraphQL Gatsby. And somebody on Twitter was like, somebody from Hasura, and it was on Twitter and said, "Hey, try this." I was trying a couple different things, and it worked. So I've been using it in a lot of projects since, and now I'm here.
Yeah, I'll add to that a little bit, which is that I'm Ilica Mahajan. I'm a data reporter on the team, and when we were conceptualizing this project and how we were going to kind of join a lot of different databases that were going to exist in multiple different places in sort of different formats being contributed to by different groups of people, David was like, "Oh, I think we should use this. I think it'll make it really easy." And I had only used just Postgres tables and things like that with like personal, on the console type ways of interacting with things. So I was just like, that seems like such a fancy tool. Like, do we really need it? And like, we could just do everything manually and on the console and things like that. And then he was like, "No, trust me. And so we started using it, and like, it's been so useful both from, bridging different sources of data and knowing that we can, join with Airtable on one side, join with, our Postgres tables on another side, join with, multiple different inputs of data. But another part that has been really useful for me is as I'm, the front end of it and interacting with the front end, especially as I'm trying to show other journalists that I'm working with what our data looks like to give them a better idea of what I'm doing. That has been really handy to just show them the console and show them all the different tables and what it looks like and filter in those places. It kind of removes the magic of a lot of the stuff because they can kind of really get an intuitive sense for what this data is looking like.
So it sounds like I have kind of a standard row of questions that I go through, but so basically the business technical problem that you had is lots of different data from lots of different places. How many different kinds of data sources were you like working with or looking at to begin with?
I think to start, at least for the Testify project, most of the things to begin with were Postgres tables But now we're going to be adding, there's, especially because we're trying to ramp up our community engagement in a lot of different places. And of course, people have different levels of familiarity with different technical tools, but people know how to use Google spreadsheets, or in our case, Airtable. And so one of the things that we're really hoping to do is have community members fill out different information in Airtable and then join that against our Postgres tables. And that becomes really easy with all of the Hasura tooling. And then I do want to add that the thing that you talked about of the being able to release certain things in specific ways with certain protections is going to come in really handy for us, because as we're doing this community involvement, one of the commitments we've made to the community is open sourcing a bunch of the data. Now, we have a lot of personally identifiable information, so we have to be careful about how we do this, because we don't want any defendant in the court system to go on blast. So we can do things, though, of obscuring different things and anonymizing things, which we will do so carefully, and then release the data. So that is actually one of the considerations that we had on the top of our mind.
In terms of the initial data sets that we used, just specifically, we had a scraped data set of cases, and cases are complex because there's metadata about a case, but then there's what's called the docket, which is sort of an enumeration of events, a chronology of things that happen in the case. So it's sort of this complex, it's not just rows and columns. It's truly relational data that way. Then we pulled in census data with a geographic component, voting data from the County Board of Elections, which also has a geographic component, and then a couple other data sets that we had to stitch in. For example, there's codes, identifiers for every charge that somebody might be charged with. Well, those have a human readable name. I mean, you can think of it as sort of a crosswalk. There's sort of a law book, and it has a chapter title, and the chapter title corresponds to drug possession. And so we have mapping that handles that. So we also have some data from the Department of Corrections about incarcerated people that we're sort of playing around with in the same database. So it's from a data journalism standpoint, especially for a team of our size, I think that's a quite complex system.
Now, was there an actual product? It was a name you dropped there a little bit ago, Testify. So is this a specific project that was what was the situation there?
We really should have started with that. I realized a couple minutes ago. Testify.news, for anybody who's who sees this in the recording, is the URL. It's a investigation of the court system in Cuyahoga County, which is in Ohio. It's where the city of Cleveland is, and it's really an unprecedented level of access to court data. Really something that has been very, very hard to get in the past.
And so this is a layering on top then, or what is the Testify project doing then? Is it specifically just trying to tear apart the data and look for abnormalities, or?
Well, we had to get the data. So first we scraped it, but at least it existed on a public website. So a big part of the work was scraping it. And then Ilica can tell you more about how we sliced it and diced it.
Yeah, so now what we have, and this project is ongoing and is ongoing for the foreseeable future. We do not have an end date on this, so this is all a work in progress right now. But currently what happens is we scrape the data and we dump all of the documents in one place. And then I have a system that goes in and basically goes through all of the documents and parses out into structured data all of the different tables that we'd be interested in filling out. So, we have a table for all the judges, we have a table for all the charges, we have a table for all the docket entries and all the defendants and cases. And so then I'm using the GraphQL mutation inserts and creating for a row for each of the cases, all of the structured data that needs to get into our tables. And then, so there's a system that's running in the cloud, basically, that'll take all of the documents and parse them and then put that structured data into the tables. And this is something that we run, semi-frequently to add in as more cases come in, or we are interested in new fields that we want to, parse out of the, the dumped documents. Then the system will go through and insert all of the rows. And then after that part, then we're doing a bunch of analysis. So like it could be as uncomplicated as how many cases are there? How many defendants are there? What is the distribution of race amongst the defendants? What is the geographic distribution of defendants? To as complicated as what are the, for this kind of charge with this kind of number of priors, if you don't accept a plea deal, what is your chance of being, what is your sentence? What is your charge outcome? What are these things? So there's different varieties of complexity when it comes to the analysis. So
architecturally, there's a lot to unpack here. So,
yes.
So when you've got the dump folders that you're running some processes on that are essentially scanning and parsing the data out, is that an event that you are then using like a cron job from Hasura to go out and check for the latest updates, or is there an event from the cloud that is just pushing it into Hasura, or where's that connection occurring for you?
I'm kicking that off at various different times. So David currently runs the scraper. So every, week or so, we'll be like, hey, let's scrape the last week of cases. And so he'll manually kick that off. And then after he kicks that off, then, whatever edits I want to do to my parsing side of like, oh, you know what, there's one field that we haven't been capturing. I haven't been capturing the status of the cases. So let me, add that field in, add that column into the Hasura tables. And then I'll change my parser, and then I've been manually kicking off a parse to go through all of the documents in 1,000 parallel jobs on the cloud to go through all of the documents in less than an hour and insert all of the records into the tables.
Part of the thing here, and it might be just kind of funny to sort of the Hasura community, despite the data being public, despite it belonging to the public, there's sort of weapons grade anti-scraping measures on the website that we're trying to scrape, so to scrape a year's worth of cases takes a month or more of continuous operations. So there's things that in another environment you might really need that kind of like automation and those triggers, but we're sort of dealing with a situation where the data is coming in very slowly, and so we can rely on sort of manual processes there. We need to get to more automation, but we're a tiny team. Donate to the marshallproject.org. We're data journalism is very resource constrained. So there's cool things we wish we could do.
There's a lot of automation I would like to do. I'm a former distributed systems programmer, so automation would be a dream goal of mine, but also takes more robust infrastructure and time and things like that. So eventually,
I was wondering because if you're a distributed engineer, because I know that there's a lot of services out there that you could stand up on something like what's it called, one of these home server systems, Unraid, for example, that they're just doing distributed mining because they're just saying like, hey, let's all pool our resources and mine together. But it'd be interesting if you could actually distribute scraping jobs, so you have kind of realistic IPs and things that would be contribute your leftover processes for good.
Well, I mean, we run everything in AWS, and they can't ban all of the IPs of the AWS space. So
yeah, we just run one container per scraper. It gets a new IP, and you can't ban the
AWS.
Amazon IP range, like your business would suffer, right? So this is how we were able to get around it, but it's exceptionally slow. I mean, it's just
interesting. Really slow. It's really interesting, huh? That's yeah. So you have you're manually triggering off these events, and that's probably partially. I was going to ask why you weren't using like a cron job. I'm guessing it's partially because you're having to commit to a time range for scraping this data that's kind of finicky to be able to pull in. What are the other like interesting parts there architecturally that you've got working with either event triggers or actions or anything else that you've got working in place right now?
Oh, well, so this isn't technically like an action or an event trigger that we're basing this off of, but we do have a pretty neat system. So for example, we're pairing Hasura with observable notebooks. So we query the data, the existing like data in our Hasura tables.
Is that ObservableHQ or what's the? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Love it. Yeah.
And all of our, like a bunch of our analysis and for example, our data fact checking is done in observable notebooks. So those are, viewable by other journalists. They're readable by, people who aren't necessarily familiar with data journalism. And so we have a system that I think is really neat and very powerful, which is we'll constantly update the tables as we're getting more information. But then all of our like analysis notebooks that contain, how many people are in different neighborhoods or, what percentage of the current defendants are of what race or things like that. It's querying off of that. And so every time you refresh that page, it'll it keeps it up to date. So this is super powerful when you're doing, last minute fact checking before the story has to go out the next day or something like that, which is that as soon as I'm done running all of my parsers, then I know that all of the facts in this observable notebook are up to date and I can just check it against the story. So I can just check every sentence against the story and I can footnote, this is the code for how I arrived at this number in the story. And then, whoever is fact checking me, double checking my code, like David can go in and be like, oh, so 10 out of 15 residents, had XYZ happen to them. Let me see how Ilica arrived at that. And so it's very, in that sense, the observability is really good. And it stays all up to date and is kind of pushing the latest status of the database right straight through.
What was the... Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, it's I think a very typical kind of data science process that you also see in data journalism is, knit a PDF out of your R notebook or take your results and put them back into a Google Doc so that you can share with collaborators or things like that. And this just kind of cuts out all that, it makes it more efficient because you're cutting that out. But really what's more important is that it makes it highly reliable, right? Like, if everybody knows to go to the notebook and look at the notebook will always be the latest, most correct information. Nobody's going to accidentally have some old version and accidentally include that in God forbid it would get included in published work, but certainly it just, the risk exists much more. When you've got different versions of analysis
you
kind
cut
of floating
something
around
or print it. Yeah. I was curious, from fringe technologies around the Hasura ecosystem, what was the leaning towards observable, which is kind of a very JavaScripty world thing, versus something like a Jupyter Notebook, which I think most people would think of when they think of data science because it's Python and things.
The main reason being, shareability with people who are not data people, right? Like even I have nothing against Jupyter Notebooks. And in fact, I prefer Python to JavaScript, like, of course. But the ability to actually communicate with people who are not data people, who are not coders, is really like just trying to start a Jupyter notebook in and of itself takes like a day of like trying to get someone on to like install everything. Like it's actually sort of like
Pip what again?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Honda install. Like you have to go through a process of installing everything, and Observable just makes it like, oh, this is already here and easy. The other thing is like chart generation, graph generation, graphics generation, super fast and easy. You can like quickly have different buttons that like it's the fastest way to build a dashboard. And so you give people filters, buttons, and all of these things, ways of interacting with a database or ways of interacting with data that requires almost zero spin up. Like people know how to interact with web pages, and it's just a really fast way of getting to a dashboard to have people who don't write code interact with data.
And we want to create that kind of awareness around data and that kind of two-way street where it's not just, the magicians off in their magic cave doing their magic data thing and spitting out some number. It's really, we're going to sit down, with other reporters and other stakeholders and really sort of explore together. A great example of this is of our use of this and I fully suspect that Hasura and other kind of like, cloud database technologies will drive more and more of this, is just simply creating tables for reporters to be able to find leads. Here's how crime changed in 100 major US cities. Here's how police staffing changed in those same cities. And that helps us pick out like, oh, this city is solving more homicides, but actually the police force got smaller. Okay, that's interesting. That's a place we can go start asking questions. So it sort of, it sort of creates a little more of a two-way street and a little bit more of an interactive process with all the stakeholders. In these sort of, we're fundamentally like it's an inquisitive sort of process. And so we can sort of be in the background turning the crank, but we can find a lot more and do a lot more meaningful work if we're surfacing this stuff more collaboratively and interactively.
When you were so graph-like relationships, there's databases for that. What was one of the reasons why you ended up sticking with relational databases as opposed to trying to get this all inside of something like a Neo4j kit or something else that was more graph-based?
Well, for me, one of the big parts of this is, first, Postgres is just awesome. It's so mature. It's the industry standard in our industry. So most people that you're gonna, working at any kind of serious level are gonna have familiarity with it or experience with it. So it's about as universal a tool as there is in data journalism, other than maybe Python. So there's that aspect of it, but also the geospatial handling is so mature. It's really, really pretty good, especially compared to many of the other options out there. And so, we're so often taking, defendants' home addresses and saying, how does it compare to the community that they live in? How does it compare to where they vote? Or connecting those things. So I think the geospatial handling is a huge part of it.
Interesting. Yeah. So it sounds like it allows you to retain larger interop with other people who are more Postgres heavy. Because once it goes into a graph database, that's a bit of a one-way street without a lot of gnashing of teeth to try and pull it back out again. But that's an interesting, it's the second time I've heard that from another, company that had a very strong graph-like data set or usage. And that's kind of, I think, where GraphQL is sort of accelerating so well. There's a lot of people that want that graph relationship behind their data, but don't necessarily want to take an obscure database to basically now make their data no longer interoperable, or it's not going to work in the next 20 years or something. And so I think it's an interesting story that I hear, a narrative I hear repeating over and over when it comes to GraphQL specifically. Yeah.
In previous, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, in previous jobs and previous projects, a lot of times you would have an ETL pipeline built to push data into Postgres. And so, you just turn on Hasura, and now you have a nice API on top of it without having to change any of the rest of your tooling. Didn't have to migrate to Neo4j, didn't have to move to a different platform, literally just run a service on top of what we're already doing, and it's easier to query.
And at the heart of it, the data is relational. Like it is like, that is the actual, like the way that the data is even coming in and makes the most sense. Like the way that we've organized it is really reflecting reality, right? Like there's a set of judges, they adjudicate cases have defendants. Like it is very much the pipeline is the way that kind of the world works. And so like in that sense, we're not fighting it, but it does mean that, like, for example, like a lot of the querying is a lot easier to digest, especially like also for people who are not as familiar with, SQL and stuff like that. It becomes a lot easier to like check the boxes and look at like a lot of the like front end tooling is really nice, and it makes it so that people who don't write SQL can, they can definitely check the boxes to build up the queries, and they're very readable in a way that maybe some of the SQL queries wouldn't be.
It's really neat to see Ilica working with other reporters on this, and really kind of, you can see that UX, that better UX than just sitting at like a SQL prompt, really does make a difference in terms of having an effective interaction there.
Did you consider any other tools besides Hasura? Like you said that you heard about it from a Twitter name drop, so thank you, random Twitter user. But did you look at any other tools before you?
It was Tanmai. He found me.
So a random Twitter user, CEO of company. Yeah, so that works. But like, was there anything else that you tried, or were comparing, or feature shopping?
I mean, had it not been for David, I would have just been doing just SQLs, like Postgres with the like bare minimum console, and just like struggling through it that way.
I mean, I've used so many things, but I've really personally and have brought this to the Marshall Project, really settled on Hasura for most of this stuff. BigQuery is very interesting to us, and has some powerful geo features that would be pretty helpful to us. So BigQuery is something that we've evaluated. I've definitely looked at some of the, even for our team, some of the Amazon products like Redshift, or even just straight SQL. That's well supported in so many tools these days, including Observable and Google Colab and other sort of interactive or shareable notebook systems. But so far, this I think this it hits a sweet spot for us, and hasn't been. We haven't had to think too much about it, and tools that get out of the way tend to be the tools that stick around.
Because it's really interesting that the canvas you mentioned there of different possibilities, because they're sort of specialized in their different areas. They all work with Hasura. Like you can attach BigQuery and Redshift and write your own SQL statements, and I think that's part of the power here, is that you're able to abstract away a lot of these underlying services into this unified interface now, where you're able to say, like, I can write SQL. I don't want to every day, but I can write it, and I'll write it once, and I'll save it in this thing, and I'll be able to reference it. But like, that's sort of, I think, the sweet spot, right? Because it's this, I can put these different pieces of data together inside of a single API. Even with the new REST connectors, you said you have Airtable interfaces. Well, you can connect directly to an Airtable API now inside of like, alongside with your Hasura databases. And so, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
That's very much something you're going to see coming out of this project. I think, relatively soon. I don't want to promise what we're going to deliver, but
I won't hold you to it.
But certainly, it's certainly, with so much of this stuff, it's like you need somebody to write the bio on a judge to go find out if they were a former prosecutor. None of this stuff, none of this stuff is available in reliable structured data from the government or anywhere else. We just got to do it. We got to go build that database. If we're, just paying citizens or, in Cleveland to go do that, they need a pretty easy interface to use. So we're going to use Airtable for that. But then I'm so excited on the Hasura side that we're going to be able to say, query for a judge and whether they were a prosecutor and their bio and information that we've collected about their electoral success, and then just be able to also output aggregate data about their cases from this raw data set. I'm really, really terrifically excited about that kind of consolidation process. That's been a real, it's Hasura, but it's other things too. But I think that's been this kind of real movement in the last couple of years. The GraphQL world, I think, really has embraced this. But we see this as journalists. This data set might have some, power, some explanatory power, reveal something. When we combine it with census data, now it's really going to tell us something. And so being able to quickly and effectively kind of like join these disparate data sources, often from different institutions, different data standards, different identifiers, if we can kind of effectively kind of join those into single interfaces, our work is better.
That's really great. Is there any like specific feature within the Hasura ecosystem that's had more value for you than another one, or would you even be able to quantifiably say, like, compared to other tools? Because it sounds like you both have some pretty rich experience in the different verticals you're dealing with, from the data, management and engineering to the actual ingest. Could you sort of say how much time it saved, or how much it's kind of made your project easier, or anything of like kind of in a quantifiable way? Or I know data scientists are probably very cautious to put a number on something that's doesn't have a fact behind it, but
yeah, we need to go through data review on that one. I think it's very hard to say.
Yeah.
I think about it in terms of capacity on the like less about savings and more about what we can do. I did a project. I can share my screen and share this if this is useful, because I could share an example of kind of the slicing and dicing and permissions thing from a different project. But so I've done 2 consecutive projects about disappearances and mass graves in Mexico. The first one was a pure Postgres kind of static process. So data went in, and then to make maps or do analysis, you run another command and it spits out all this stuff you need to make the maps and do the analysis. And then for this next project, we've used Hasura on top of a similar Postgres database. And it just makes the sorts of analysis and visualizations that we can do and share in the group, it just expands what's possible in the amount of time and with the resources that we have. So, did we save time? Yeah, I mean, we did, because now we have capacity to do more. But I really see it as sort of expanding what's possible in our field as much as it is sort of efficiency. But that's also because the dynamics of efficiency in our field are I think, very different than maybe more purely commercial pursuits.
While you're pulling that up, because I can imagine that there's a fair amount of difficulty onboarding somebody to the scope of data. Like, so if somebody were to join in, and for them to be able to grok the full ecosystem of the data you have available, has having that all inside of a single API been helpful in that regard to help people see sort of the data sources, or has it been more of a just here's your weekend reading. We'll see you on Monday, and hope you have this figured out by then.
I think the thing that is helpful about it is that we can like give people, like, we don't have to give them insight into the whole structure. Like, for example, working with the like, you know, people on the ground who are filling out this Airtable, like they only know that they have to fill out the Airtable. Like they don't have to be concerned with anything else. And so in that sense, the onboarding is easier because they don't have to be aware of how the rest of the system is working. And then like similarly on the querying side, like not everybody who's working on the project needs to be aware of how the tables were built in the first place. Like they can just, you know, see how I'm querying it and make some adjustments, particularly on joins, which, you know, for an average person who's coming in, SQL joins and how to optimize them and how to think about them are kind of tricky concepts. And that can be, you know, kind of abstracted away with some of the querying because they can look at how I'm querying different things and the flow of like what can be indexed and what indexes you can use to efficiently query the system. And you can try out different kinds of queries in order to see what's returning faster. The fact that you can kind of abstract that away without really totally understanding how these joins are working in the back end is really handy. The SQL joins are a little, you know, harder to understand.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at 2/3 of the engineering team, and I'm barely engineering anything on this project. It's really Ilica and another reporter named Anna Flag. One place where we do, I think, see this is Anna's more of sort of a reporter. She does a lot of data analysis in R. Where that abstraction kind of comes in handy is Ilica can optimize a relationship. And you know, from Anna's standpoint, just, you know, the query just got faster.
I think it's back to your capacity argument, right? Because you're taking people who have a strong domain expertise in different areas and essentially making them operational as engineers because they're able to approach this content in a way they're able to actually work, which is really fascinating because we saw this with the last customer I talked to, like a bunch of biologists, and we were able to make them operational because they were able to actually get around this really easy.
Send us the recording. I'm stealing that because that is such a good way of putting something that's really important to us kind of technically in this environment, right? Like, you know, you got a bunch of reporters, you got a bunch of biologists. They're smart, engaged people, but like they're not engineers. How do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, it's an interesting pattern I'm seeing, is that people who get the source material can also now get the technology to make it actually operationable, and so that's something that's pretty cool. So
I'll just oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it decreases my personal workload, right? Like that I can supercharge these reporters by teaching them something that doesn't require them to understand all of SQL or all of how database indexing works or all of these things. I can just be like, look, write these queries like this GraphQL query like this, and you're good to go. And you can, and they're smart enough to obviously know how to change out different things. Like, okay, not the cases table, I need the judges table, and I'm going to join it with this. Like they can make those, the little changes, like it parameterizes what is otherwise a pretty complex idea.
And even for lower skilled users, download a slice and pivot it in Excel. You know, we've got plenty of people who really can't write code, but do know how to pivot, do know how to do stuff in Excel. And so, you know, again, it's a way of delivering that.
Or demystifying it.
What's that?
Or demystifying it, right? Like even if they can't download and pivot or any of those things, people have a general sense of, if they watch you do something, they'll gain the intuition for knowing what kinds of questions are or are not answerable. Because the biggest problem that a lot of data journalists will face is that we're treated as if we're some sort of magician that could pull out any answer from the database. And so it's really helped to go in with reporters to show them what all this data looks like, how I can filter it in different ways so that when they ask me questions, they have a much better idea of what is possible to answer.
I'm going to share real quick.
Yeah.
Something that I think will just be of interest. So this is not published yet. This will be published soon. It's very much a pattern that I'm hoping our Testify project embraces. So this is a database of disappearance reports in Mexico. It's in Spanish, sorry.
I took a year
so there's a couple things happening here. So there's Hasura permissions that only allow anonymous access to non-personally identifiable fields. It's a complex data set, but if you only need, we sort of talked to potential users and understood that they really needed the data state by state and needed certain fields. So we sort of flatten it out into something very CSV ready. So you just go here, you say, okay, I want the state of Guanajuato. It takes a second to query, and then I click this and I can download a CSV that I can pivot, analyze, whatever. And then down here, what you're seeing is the documentation from Hasura. There's just a metadata query. And so these are all the fields that are available for anonymous access via the API. It's just a very simple query, actually, just to get them, this meta query. We don't have to put any restriction on it by just making an unauthenticated query. It just tells me the fields that are available to me. And so, we've got this nice little page for expert users to use to download slices of this data. They probably wouldn't be able to be, fully interacting with the GraphQL database via GraphQL. But it's this nice kind of middle ground where we can sort of use the API to package data in ways that are going to be useful to them.
Yeah, that's great. I love the observable, and your project is way cooler than the last one I built, which was a wine database with matching food pairings. Back when I worked at a CMS company with GraphQL. But yeah, we've gotten through actually all of my specific questions. I would be curious to know, like, what's your future plans with Hasura as you see it, taking on new angles or responsibilities in the project, or what are even areas where GraphQL and Hasura specifically in that would even be able to help the use case of data journalism specifically as a topic. So I think it's a very interesting whole range that's not tapped so much yet from the GraphQL ecosystem, because it does make a lot of sense, but a lot of times you are talking about you need data engineers to stitch these pieces together. What are some areas where it would be helpful, or things that you think may make a lot of sense?
I think our next steps are going to be on the data release side. I think that in general, our field needs more practice in bringing data back to the community after we get it, and making it accessible for, different kinds of people to engage with it and answer their own questions with it. Because I think that that's going to drive a lot more understanding of society if people can actually see the things that we see. So from that angle, like, I think the things that I'm going to be looking into next and reading more about with Hasura is like just how we're going to, do the things that David was just talking about on a project that I wasn't on, of like, how do we do the data release in a way that's safe and responsible, but does put data and, power back in the hands of community members.
That was so powerful. Yes. I feel like everything else I'm going to say is really boring. Data journalism in the news industry has been slow, I think, to embrace GraphQL. It's interesting. It's been interesting to see. It's the industry that gave us frameworks like Django. But this is, this is an area where I think, well, my opinion is we're a little behind. Others might say we're being appropriately cautious in embracing new technologies. But there's a really exciting project out of Stanford called Big Local News. And so they're really trying to consolidate lots of data sets under a unified GraphQL API. And one thing that's very exciting to me is that interoperability. That we could set up a Hasura instance that takes our data and a couple of their data sets and just stitches them together. And we can sort of benefit from them, and they can benefit from us through all the kind of schema federation and all that kind of stuff. It's so exciting. I mean, it just solves such a fundamental problem that I've got data set A, data set B. They're only really meaningful when I can bring them together. I'll give you another example, campaign finance. There's a thing called, wait, why am I blanking on the name of it? But, well, there's a there's a national GraphQL database of state legislatures' activities. So at a previous job, I took the campaign finance data from the state and mapped it with Hasura with this other GraphQL API that had information about people's voting records, when they were elected, all this sort of stuff. And so I was able to sort of draw on this other data source maintained by the community and smush it together with what these people's political action committee was doing. The tricky thing there was that it actually required manually figuring out this politician is connected to this PAC. And we were not able to find a solution to the joining problem other than research and manually creating the join. But once we did, all of a sudden, it's very interesting to see people's voting records next to their fundraising records.
Yeah. I think for a long time, journalism has been this thing that, and partially because of capability, has been in this thing that we've always been very in the weeds, talking to individuals or tracking the records of individuals and looking at things at a very zoomed in level. And I think now we're starting to get better at zooming out, and the zooming out requires a lot of joining of different data sets, because theoretically a lot of things are transparent, but they're not meaningful unless you have a lot of different context that you're bringing in from a lot of different places. And as journalism tries to do this thing where we do a better job of doing system analysis as opposed to making everyone out to be either a devil or a hero, and instead looking at systems, looking at incentives, looking at how different things encourage different behavior in society as a whole, then a lot of this data analysis, joining different types of data together, and kind of that zooming out is only made possible by, bringing disparate sets of data together.
I think Context QL sounds like a nice conference name for data journalism with GraphQL.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, no, that's really it's really interesting to see. I mean, I know that from Hasura's side, we're working on more and more ways to bring any data source in, whether it be a database proper or whether it be something that has a data interface that can be mapped to an interaction. So I think that's definitely an area where even as a company, it's interesting for us to explore, but also there's a lot of benefit there in terms of we've been looking at taking domain experts, giving them understandable querying languages. You don't need a lot of data engineers like Ilica, but if you get somebody who knows what they're doing, and then you put them with people who know the data deeply, I mean, you're able to spit nails. It's really, really powerful. And I think that's a pretty cool thing to see. It's a really fascinating project. Is there anything else that you would like to know from our side, or anything that would be helpful for you guys going forward? We like data journalism projects. That kind of aligns with our company values as a whole, but
I don't think I have any questions. This was really fun. I really enjoyed, thinking about this, and it made me reflect more on our processes and the things that we are now capable of, that I think puts us in an interesting space.
That's how you know they were good questions.
Well, I try. Would it be possible, Ilica, to get an architectural diagram of like kind of roughly how you have things set up? If you don't have one already, one interesting tool that I just came across recently is called OneModel. It might be onemodel.db or something, but you'll find it pretty quick. I contacted the guy right away, so now there is actually a Hasura service you can choose for one of the icons. But maybe that helps to speed up a diagram, but yeah.
Yeah, that would be perfect. And actually, as you were talking and we were explaining the steps, I was like, wow, I should just draw this out, because I can see the picture of like how I've stitched everything together in terms of an architectural diagram, but I've never drawn it, like actually drawn it out.
Great.
So,
well,
yes,
then I will reach out within a week to probably remind you.
Yes,
but
I
that'd
could
be
definitely
great.
use
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that'd be fantastic. Awesome. This was so much fun. I really appreciate it. It was thanks for making the time, and thank you for taking on really important like topics like this. I mean, I am an American, so criminal justice is something we haven't done great, and so it is good to see people putting this. I mean, somebody who's wrongfully convicted or whatever else sitting behind bars is somebody who's sitting behind bars every day, every minute, and we should all have a much more urgent perspective on that. So appreciate you guys fighting that. So yeah. All right.
Pleasure.
Have a good one, and we'll be in touch soon.
Sounds good.
Bye.